Hi there, it's time for another Christmas book. Tonight I'm reading a book called Christmas Oranges. Christmas Oranges. Okay. In a town not so far away, and in a time not so long ago, there lived a little girl. Her name might have been Eve or Mary or Sarah, but no one knew for certain, for this little girl had been left on the steps of an orphanage. A few years earlier, a note had been pinned to her nightshirt saying, "Please take care of this baby. She is a good baby." No clue was given as to her name. The lady in charge of the orphanage, Mrs. Hartley, began calling the baby Rose because of her rosy cheeks. She had been ever since. Rose's early years were spent at the Greenwoods orphanage. She was loved and well taken care of by Mrs. Hartley, and because she could remember no other home, she was happy. She used to tell herself she had 30 brothers and sisters, for she loved all the children at the orphanage. Sometimes they had disagreements and arguments, as the brothers and sisters do, but they still cared for each other. One wintry November, when Rose was 8 years old, a terrible flu epidemic swept through the country. People old and people young became ill. People old and people young died. The orphanage was no exception. Many of the children, became very ill, and some of the children died. Mrs. Hartley, with her kind, loving heart, cared for the sick children as if they were her own. She bathed their fevered faces with cool water. She coaxed them to sip broth. She held them close and rocked them through the night. But after many days and nights of this, Mrs. Hartley too caught the terrible flu and slipped quietly from this life. With her death came the closing of Greenwood's orphanage. Mrs. Hartley had no children to carry on her work, and the townspeople felt they were too poor to take on the added burden of the orphanage. It was decided that the children would be sent to other institutions throughout the country. And so a few days later, Rose found herself on a train traveling through the night to a new town and a new home at another orphanage. As Rose timidly stepped through the doors of Iron Gates Orphanage, doesn't even sound good, does it? She could not help feeling scared and disappointed. Her new home was nothing like the one she was used to. Instead of warm, soft blankets on the beds, there were scratchy gray ones. Instead of hand-stitched rugs in the halls, there were bare floors. Instead of kind, loving Mrs. Hartley to care for the children, there was stern, strict Mr. Crampton to run the orphanage. Instead of 30 familiar friends smiling at her, there were 30 strangers staring at her. "Silence," Mr. Crampton ordered before marching forward to give Rose a disapproving, inspecting look. Turning to the other children, he said, "This is Rose. See that she understands the rules of Iron Gates Orphanage. Emily, take her to the sleeping room and then show her the chores she will be expected to do. The rest of you go back to your duties." A young girl about Rose's age beckoned for Rose to follow her. They walked silently to the end of the hall and just as quietly climbed the stairs. Once they had started down the hallway and could no longer be seen from the entry, Emily leaned over to whisper quietly to Rose, "I'm glad you're here. I'm 10. How old are you?" Rose had been so frightened by Mr. Crampton's order for silence, when it seemed to her the children were already silent, that she dared not speak. She kept her eyes lowered and did not reply. Emily took her hand, patted it, and whispered, "It's all right to whisper up here. Mr. Crampton can't hear us. It's only when we're downstairs or when he's around that we have to hold still and be still. That's rule number 1. Hold still and be still. Up here we can talk and be friends." Even though Rose still dared not speak, she smiled a tiny, shy smile at Emily. Over the next few weeks, Rose learned the rules and ways of Iron Gates Orphanage, some from the other children whispering them to her, and some after she'd broken a rule. Breaking a rule was the hardest way to learn, for Mr. Crampton believed that once a rule was broken, there must be a punishment. Explaining to him that a new child didn't know a rule did no good. He said that if he'd let one person off for that excuse, others would try to use it too. Every rule broken must be met with punishment. Mr. Crampton's 3 favorite punishments were sentencing a child to miss a meal, do extra chores, or spend the evening by themselves. Rose soon learned or guessed most of the rules and was able to avoid punishment. November's white, bleak snows soon became beautiful accents to December's Christmas greens and reds. Everywhere the Iron Gates children walked, they saw signs that Christmas would soon come. They would stand out in the cold evening air and watch through lighted windows as happy, smiling families decorated trees or gathered around pianos for singing or baked wonderful Christmas treats in warm, lighted kitchens. On one of these evenings, as Rose and Emily stood watching a lovely little girl twirling around her parlor in her pretty new flannel nightgown, Emily explained to Rose about Christmas at Iron Gates. She told how Mr. Crampton always said he would like to forget Christmas altogether, but the townspeople wouldn't let him. To keep them happy and to keep up appearances, he allowed a tree to be put up on Christmas Eve after the children had gone to bed. He didn't want it up any earlier because he said it excited the children and made them noisy and unmanageable. And that does happen. One generous older man in town always donated a box of oranges to the orphanage for the children's Christmas breakfast. To avoid buying shiny glass balls or other ornaments, Mr. Crampton had the oranges strung with loops and placed on the tree. Emily told Rose how beautiful the dark orange color looked against the pine boughs, and how wonderful the citrus and pine fragrance was that filled the entry. Rose had never seen or smelled an orange before. At Greenwood's orphanage, there hadn't been extra money for such an expensive treat. Christmas morning surprise there had been a small spoonful of sugar on the porridge. The children had always debated whether it was best to stir the sugar in and try to sweeten the whole bowlful, or leave it in a little pile in the middle of the porridge and eat it all in one delicious bite. Emily tried to explain to Rose about oranges. She said they were sweeter than sugar in a clean, fresh way. She'd thought about it a lot, and she was sure that angels ate oranges in heaven. Rose listened to all this with wide-eyed wonder. She didn't know how she could possibly wait for 3 more days until Christmas came. On Christmas Eve, as the children lay in their beds, they whispered excitedly how beautiful the tree would look and how grand it would be to have a touch of Christmas in the orphanage, even if it were only for a day. It was good that Mr. Crampton's room was downstairs, for he surely would have been angry with all the whispering and wiggling in the bedrooms that night. Rose lay in her bed and tried to go to sleep. She held perfectly still. She closed her eyes. She thought of the words to the lullabies that Mrs. Hartley had sung each night. She tried breathing in and out very slowly, but no matter how hard she tried, she kept thinking about the oranges that would be on the tree, the oranges that she would finally get to taste the next morning. As the night slowly crept by, Rose tried to guess what time it was. When she could stand it no longer, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door. She looked back, but the other children were still asleep. She opened the door carefully so as not to disturb the others and softly, silently, padded down the hall to the banister railing. Kneeling down, she gazed in wonder at the beautiful tree with the prized oranges and shimmering candles trimming it. Rose knelt there for only a moment, then she just silently walked back to her bed. She lay down and was at last able to sleep. Now, what Rose hadn't seen was that Mr. Crampton was awake and standing in the doorway to his room. He'd watched Rose walk to the rail, kneel down, and then return to her room. He had almost called her back, then and there, to give her a lecture and pronounce a punishment. At the last minute, he had decided to wait until morning, when he could use Rose as an example to teach all of the children a lesson in obedience. The sun had barely begun to outline the housetops when the children were awake, dressed and waiting in 2 straight lines in the aisle between their beds, standing perfectly still. Had never been so hard. Well, Mr. Crampton observed dourly, that's one good thing about Christmas. All of you can remember how to behave on Christmas morning. Before we start downstairs, we need to take care of someone who didn't know how to behave last night. Rose, for sneaking out of bed and wandering in the halls after the lights were out last night, you will be punished. This is a most serious offense, so you will receive all 3 punishments. The children gasped. No one had ever been given all 3 punishments at one time before. Mr. Crampton paused for a moment to let his words sink in before he continued. You will spend the day up here by yourself. You will scrub the floors of these rooms, and you will not get a Christmas orange. The rest of you, go downstairs. Rose, go get your buckets and begin. The joy had been taken out of the morning for all the children. They knew how much Rose had been looking forward to tasting her first orange. They had all told her how wonderful oranges were and had been waiting to see her face as she tasted one for the first time. The children filed slowly out of the room and down the stairs. They each took their orange from the tree and walked quietly into the cold hall to eat breakfast. On one occasion, when the older gentleman had delivered the oranges to Irongate, the small boy had asked if the children had to eat the oranges for breakfast or if they could save them and eat them later. The gentleman had laughed heartily and told the children that because it was Christmas, they could eat the oranges whenever they wanted. Mr. Crampton would have liked to order the children to eat them at breakfast to have the mess over and done with, but he didn't dare go against what the old gentleman had said. While Emily sat looking at her orange and wishing Rose could have one, a wonderful idea came to her. Her heart started beating faster, her eyes sparkled, her mouth curved up in a happy smile. Mr. Crampton was called to the front door, and as soon as the door closed behind him, Emily whispered to the child next to her. He smiled broadly and quickly whispered to the child next to him. And so it continued until every child had heard the message. One by one, the oranges disappeared from the table and were placed in pockets for safekeeping. When Mr. Crampton returned to the room, he noticed the oranges were missing from the table, but knew from the absence of peelings the children hadn't eaten them. He decided it was because the children were too sad about Rose to eat the fruit this morning. He nodded his head in satisfaction. Sure, he had put his point across. The children did their chores as they did every day. Once the oranges had been passed out, Mr. Crampton treated Christmas like any other day. The children went about their duties quietly, but each pocket still showed a bump where the orange was hiding. At supper, the children ate their meals and then quietly slipped the oranges from their pockets, peeled them, and ate them too. Each evening they went to bed immediately after cleaning up from supper, and tonight was no exception. As the children doodled or climbed the stairs to bed, they kept their eyes down and their faces solemn. Mr. Crampton couldn't have been more pleased with how subdued the orphans were. The children entered the dark sleeping room quietly. Each pair of eyes was quickly drawn to Rose, who lay huddled on her bed, her face turned away from the door. Emily tiptoed over until she could see Rose's tear-stained cheeks and swollen eyes, now closed in sleep. She gently touched Rose's shoulder to waken her. Wake up, Rose. Rose opened her red, swollen eyes, and then, as memories of the day returned, they again filled with tears. "Oh, Emily," she sobbed, "this has been the worst day I've ever had. I didn't know it was so wrong to go look at the tree, and now I've missed it and the beautiful oranges." Emily hugged Rose as any real sister would and whispered, "Don't cry any more. We have a surprise for you." At Rose's first sobs, the children gathered round her. Now from a pinafore pocket came a small white bundle. Emily took it and gently placed it in Rose's hands. Because no lights were allowed on in the sleeping rooms, Rose couldn't see what Emily had handed her. She turned toward the windows where soft moonlight spilled in through the bare, dusty panes. There in her hand was a handkerchief that had been taken from the clean laundry that afternoon. It was carefully folded over a round object. Rose hardly dared to hope that this might be what she thought it was. She looked up at the children gathered around in her bed. In the faint light, she could see the excitement on their faces as they watched her every move. With shaking fingers, Rose peeled back the corners of the handkerchief, and there in the palm of her hand was an orange. Not an ordinary orange, but an orange that was lopsided and uneven, an orange made up of a segment from each child's orange. While the children had sat at the table quietly eating, each one had secretly passed a section of orange down to the girls at the ends of the tables. The girls had put the pieces in the clean handkerchiefs in their pockets. "Smell it," someone whispered excitedly. Rose raised the handkerchief to her face and drew in a deep, fragrant breath. She closed her eyes and held her breath for the longest time, then released it through an ear-to-ear smile. All of the children smiled with her. "Taste it," someone else whispered. Rose slowly raised a segment to her lips. She opened her mouth and took a gentle nibble. Her eyes widened in surprise, and her mouth slightly puckered at that first tangy, sweet taste. The children were watching so closely that as Rose opened her mouth, their lips parted too. And when they saw her pucker and then smile, they all quietly laughed and hugged each other. As if by magic, several more clean, orange-filled handkerchiefs were pulled from pinafore pockets and opened up. The orange segments were quickly broken into smaller pieces. and one was given to every child. Each one took one last sniff of that fresh orange smell, and one final lick of that tangy, delicious juice before popping the last small bite into a waiting mouth. While the children enjoyed the last of the Christmas oranges, they all commented on how they had never had such sweet fruit before. This year's oranges were the best by far. What the children didn't realize until many years later was that the oranges were the best that day, because they were sweetened with friendship, kindness, and love. In the years to come, many of those children at the orphanage had more money and possessions than they had ever dreamed possible, but they never forgot the feelings that were in their hearts that day as they each shared a small slice of their Christmas orange. It's a great book. Good night.